Good morning. I hope that you are really well this week. This is the third episode in this box set of talks focused on Saul the Apostle. And today I want to begin with a question for you. What's the story that you're living in? You know, we human beings tend to think in stories rather than facts and numbers. And your answer to that strange question probably begins with where you were born or the names of your parents and your education, your career and so on. But if I was to press you harder, you might recognise that your story is part of a bigger story of the culture and society that you are part of. I'm reading 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari, and in this book he describes three grand stories that he says were formulated by the global elites in New York, London, Berlin and Moscow in the early 20th century to explain the past and predict the future of the world. He called them the fascist story, the communist story and the liberal story. The fascist story explained history as a struggle among nations and envisioned a world dominated by one human group that violently subdued the others. The communist story explained history as a struggle among different classes and envisioned a world in which all groups are united by a centralised social system that ensures equality even at the price of freedom. The liberal story explained history as a struggle between liberty and tyranny, and envisioned a world in which all humans would cooperate freely and peacefully with minimum self-central control, but even at the price of some inequality. Harari comments that the conflict amongst these three stories reached its first critical peak in the Second World War, which knocked out the fascist story with the defeat of Nazi Germany and statist Japan. From the late 1940s to the late 1980s, the world became really a battleground between two remaining stories, communism and liberalism. Then the communist story collapsed along with the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, and the liberal story was left as the dominant guide to the human past and the guide to the future, or so it seemed. Harari actually suggests that since the global financial crash in 2008, people all over the world have become disillusioned with the liberal story. Dividing wars like Trump's Mexico wall are going up. Resistance to immigration and trade agreements is mounting. Ostensibly democratic governments are undermining the independence of the legal system and restricting freedom, and portraying opposition as treason. Presidents in countries like Turkey and Russia experiment with pseudo-democracies and dictatorships in everything but name. Harari suggests 2016, marked by the Brexit vote and the election of Trump, as the moment when this tidal wave of disillusionment with the liberal story reached the shores of Western Europe and North America. He says, "Some have discovered a liking for the old hierarchical world, and they just don't want to give up their racial, national or gendered privileges. Others have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that liberalisation and globalisation are a huge racket, empowering a tiny elite at the expense of the masses." Now, you may not entirely agree with Harari, but it's fair to say that there's a lot in that description that fits with the history of the last 100 years. And of course, our parents, grandparents and great-grandparents lived through that story and passed on their experiences and culture to each subsequent generation. Our cultural story and values are a bit like the air that we breathe. We tend to take it for granted. We absorb it without noticing it, and we rarely stop to ask questions about it. Just for a moment, reflect on how much you are a child of the liberal story. How much do we love our freedom? Freedom to worship the God of our choice, freedom to vote for the political party of our choice, to travel wherever and whenever we want, to express our opinion without fear, to buy whatever we want at the cheapest price, to gain a top-class education, to earn more money if we are good at our job, to protect our privacy, to expect the police to protect us rather than intimidate us, to have access to justice when we are a victim of crime, to be able to enjoy the next blockbuster film, book, mobile phone or car whenever it comes out. You know, you can see how a lot of what we treasure is part of the liberal story. There are clearly huge consequences for the liberal story, like the incalculable damage that our way of life is doing to the planet, and the unsustainable and immoral levels of inequality that exist across the globe. And of course, we cannot keep going like this without finding solutions to those two huge consequences. But nevertheless, the liberal story is the big story that we are all part of, that we still probably, if we're honest, want to be part of, right? So let's now turn our attention to Saul. Because it's tempting as it might seem, we can't imagine that Saul was living in our present story. His big story was very different to ours. In the first episode of this box set, I described Saul's personal story, but today I want to describe the bigger story that Saul was part of. The story that Saul lived in is what scholars call Second Temple Judaism. This is the air that Saul breathed. And Saul's big cultural story begins in Genesis 12 through chapter 18 with the story of a man called Abraham and his God called Yahweh. And Yahweh makes a promise to Abraham that he will protect, provide for, and be present with him and his descendants forever. And through them, do the same for every other person that ever lived. 4 generations after this, some of his descendants migrate to Egypt from their home in the Jordan Valley, driven by an extreme famine, which lasts 7 years. 400 years later, there's about 3 million of Abraham's descendants, now called Israelites, named after Jacob, who changed his name to Israel after a wrestling match with God. And they're living in Egypt, and most of them are slaves making bricks. Egypt is the superpower in the Mediterranean region, and there is no way that they are going to give 3 million slaves their freedom. Out of the depths of their despair, Yahweh answers the cry of the Israelites through one of their own, a man called Moses. And literally 3 million Israelites up sticks, gather the possessions, literally millions of livestock, and start the long walk home. Pursued by the Egyptian army, they are miraculously saved from genocide by Yahweh, who divides the Red Sea so the Israelites can pass through safely to the other side. That Yahweh had acted on his promise to Abraham by emancipating 3 million Israelites only intensified their shatterproof trust in the covenant agreement between Abraham and Yahweh. And from Abraham right through to the present day, the nation of Israel has trusted in the faithfulness of Yahweh to his covenant with them. Ask any Jew today, and they will tell you that the Exodus is the defining story of their collective story. They celebrate it every year as the most incredible demonstration of God's love and grace towards them. So what about that second temple bit? Well, saved through the Exodus and reunited with each other and with Yahweh, the people of Israel finally get home to the Jordan Valley. They settle down, they build towns and villages and enjoy their newfound freedom. Over time, they establish a monarchy, and the second King David, the greatest of their kings, draws up the designs for a temple in Jerusalem. And this temple is built to house the Ark of the Covenant, which is the dwelling place, the Shekinah of the presence of God. See, what made the Israelites unique amongst all the tribes in the Middle East was that during their 40-year journey from Egypt to the Jordan Valley, Yahweh protected them from their enemies, provided food and water for 3 million people, and was present with them in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a tent-like structure that was at the center of their encampment and housed the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the importance of God's presence with the Israelites cannot be overstated. It was central to Yahweh's promise to protect, provide, and be that reassuring presence to them all. So although David is too old to build the temple, he sets up his own son Solomon to build the most incredible temple that the world has ever seen. If it was still standing, it would be considered one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world. The reigns of David and Solomon were a golden age for the nation of Israel. It was a period of sustained peace, secured with complete military domination of the region, huge economic prosperity, and a period of enduring artistic creativity. This was the period when the incredible book of Psalms were written, many of them by David himself, as well as the wisdom literature of Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. Israel for this period was the dominant regional superpower, and people from all over the world were drawn to enjoy and to contribute to its affluence and influence. So far, so good. But things start to go wrong after Solomon. Many of the following generations of kings are corrupt. There's huge inequality. The weak and the vulnerable are abused and exploited. Leadership breaks down and the kingdom splinters into its 12 tribes. 10 tribes in the north band together and call themselves Israel, while 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, band together and call themselves Judah, the kingdom of Judah, from which the collective noun Jews is derived. Egypt's status as the regional superpower has waned, but has been replaced by the nation of Assyria, the empire of Assyria, which invades the 10 northern tribes, destroying their identity. 125 years later, the Babylonian Empire swallows up the Assyrian Empire and destroys the kingdom of Judah, Jerusalem, and the temple that was the dwelling place for the presence of Yahweh. Eventually, however, in the way that it is with empires, the Babylonian Empire is then swallowed up by the Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. And under his leadership, the Jews are permitted to return to Jerusalem and to begin rebuilding the walls of the city. And importantly, construction of a second temple, which begins around 520 BC. But there's a problem. Although the Jews are back in their own land, they are not really free. And the second temple is not finished. In fact, it was never finished. Herod was still building it during the time of Jesus. It was an unfinished temple, and a temple without, in popular opinion, the dwelling presence of Yahweh. The Jews are still living under the Persian Empire until about 332 BC, when another empire takes over, another one. This time it's the Greeks under Alexander the Great. 160 years of Greek domination was largely sympathetic to the Jewish culture, respecting and preserving Jewish institutions. That is, until a king called Antiochus IV. He banned the practice of the Jewish religion and Mosaic law, and to top it off, he set up a statue of the Greek god Zeus in the second temple and sacrificed a pig to it, which was a sacrilege, an absolute sacrilege. This deliberate provocation sparked a military revolution under the leadership of a local hero called Judas Maccabeus, and a small army of soldiers removed the Antiochus troops and set up their own government. And in an event still remembered by Jews today, in the celebration of Hanukkah, they purified the temple. Known as the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabean family then held on to power in Palestine for the next 100 years, until the Roman general Pompey invaded Jerusalem in 63 BC, bringing the whole land under Roman control. So, for 500 years, the Jews have lived under the boot of the Persians, the Greeks, then the Romans, not free to live as they choose. And they were impatient for Yahweh to honour his covenant with them and come and rescue them again. Their prayer was simply, Yahweh, please step in and do it again. And this is why, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, the people shouted, Hosanna, which means liberate us, save us. They sang it because they dared to believe in that moment that he was their Messiah that they were waiting for. Tragically, by the end of that week, Jesus of Nazareth, their latest hope, was crucified on the Roman cross, crushing their dreams. That, friends, in a nutshell, is the big story that Saul the Pharisee grew up with. I think if we, children of the liberal story, encountered Saul and the other apostles, children of the Second Temple story, we might have some difficulty understanding each other. See, for them, being saved meant their whole nation being liberated from the Roman Empire and being able to return to the glory days of King David and Solomon. If you visit the catacombs in Rome, where many of these early devotees of Jesus were held in prison, you will notice that early images painted by these devotees were images of deliverance, like Daniel in the lion's den, or the 3 young men in a fiery furnace, or the 3 million exodus from Egypt. Their symbol or motif wasn't the cross that Jesus was crucified on. This was because, to them, Jesus was the liberator. He was the emancipator. Jesus was the new Moses leading a whole nation to freedom. Maybe it is our cultural preference for individualism, but for many people, the liberation that Jesus offers is a personal liberation from those wounds, addictions, and habits that keep us from being fully ourselves. Let me say this, don't worry. Jesus does want to liberate us from these personal constraints, but his liberation is much bigger than that. Liberation for Jesus was cosmic, and it was personal, and everything else in between. Saul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 20 to 21, "For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God." Saul sees Jesus as the liberator who will fulfill Yahweh's promise to Abraham that through him all nations will experience the protection, the provision, and the presence of God, not just the genetic descendants of Abraham, but all people. Galatians 3, 7-9, "Understand then," Saul says, "that those who have faith are children of Abraham. Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. So those who rely on faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith." Saul sees that the story of liberation by Jesus is not just for the Jews, but it is for every one of us and the world in which we live, indeed even the universe in which we live. But Saul has come to understand that liberation does not come through acts of violence and rebellion. He sees that Jesus has brought liberation through self-sacrifice. Not surprising then that others have followed Jesus' example since then in order to liberate. Think of Saul's own self-sacrifice to bring Yahweh's liberation to the Gentiles. Think of Gandhi's self-sacrifice to bring freedom to India. Think of Mandela's sacrifice to bring freedom for black and ethnic minority groups in South Africa. Think of Emily Pankhurst's self-sacrifice to bring freedom for women to vote. Perhaps a question to ponder today is how much of the liberal story that we live in has roots in the liberation wrought by Jesus on the cross, and how much of it doesn't. If we are devotees of Jesus, if you are a devotee of Jesus, then where do you personally need liberation and freedom from those things that restrict and control you? That's a question to always ask yourself, because Jesus really does want to liberate you from those habits and those addictions and those wounds that control you. He wants to give you freedom. He wants to liberate you personally. But it is also more than that. Perhaps the question arising right now is, what are we doing to copy Jesus' example of self-sacrifice in order to bring liberation in our present world? Perhaps it's paying a fair price for a product to release workers in developing countries from poverty. Perhaps it's taking steps to reduce our carbon footprint to release our ecosystems from the human-induced climate change. Perhaps it's campaigning for justice for people who are treated unfairly because of their political, religious views, because of the colour of their skin or their sexuality. Perhaps it's campaigning for an end to war in places like Syria so that innocent people can be set free from death and destruction. Perhaps it's running a business in such a way that doesn't exploit, but liberates employees, suppliers, and customers. Perhaps it's working in health and social care to liberate people from ill health and disability. For Saul, the liberation and salvation wrought by Jesus on the cross was so much more than just an individual spiritual experience. It was liberation on a global and cosmic scale. Why don't we pray together?